and welcome to Dialogue. The world's population crossed the 8 billion threshold late last year from about 2.5 billion in 1950, reflecting rapid population growth over the past few decades. Meanwhile, India is projected to become the world's most populous country within 3 months, surpassing China. Should we celebrate or be concerned with the fast population growth? And what impact will these demographic changes have on the planet and society? To help us answer these questions, I'm joined today by Professor John Gong from the University of International Business and Economics, Professor Benoit Hardy-Chartrand from Temple University, Japan, and Lauren Johnston, Associate Professor of the China Studies Center of the University of Sydney. That's our topic. I'm Xu Qinduo. Welcome to the discussion. Well, Lauren, I will start with you. Tell us, what are the factors that contributed to the rapid population growth?
Hello, Qinduo. Thanks for having me. The factors contributing to rapid population growth over the last century were dramatic gains in public health, the spread of antibiotics, and, the ability to share lessons in healthcare very quickly, very easily across countries, and standards of nutrition. And then at the other end so that both helped to decrease the number of the number of babies dying. It increased people's chance of living, and it has also increased life expectancy. So you have the two factors around the world. The number of children being born overall has now peaked, but over the century it increased a lot, and people are living much longer. So the aggregate of that means there's many more people on the planet than there used to be.
Mm-hmm. So Benoit, here's a question, should we celebrate or should we be concerned? There's a cause of concern. Some people would say, there's overpopulation. You can say there are, response from the use of words. What do you make of that?
Well, overpopulation used to be a major concern, especially in the 1960s and 70s. If we look at a lot of the news footage from that era, this was on everybody's mind, overpopulation. But now with a lot of countries, especially in the West, talking about population decline, and of course the country I'm in is a great example of that in Japan, but we see that also in many European countries, in other countries in Asia as well, like South Korea and China. So overpopulation is no longer really the issue that we believed it was in the 1960s and 70s. Now, is it a cause for concern? Is it a cause for celebration? It's a double-edged sword, really. There are some positive aspects of population having now grown to 8 billion people in certain countries with growing populations like India that can present an opportunity in terms of economic growth. But there are other challenges as well that come with with a growing population around the world.
Mm-hmm. Well, John, obviously the UN, United Nations, celebrate this moment, 8 billion. That's the milestone moment to celebrate this human development. So there are obviously positive factors. I mean, we celebrate and we like to see with this development, right? And also, as Benoit pointed out, economically, that will be contribution with the growth of the population.
The population growth is not very balanced. It is also very much, in my view, driven by religious beliefs as well. For example, you look at South American, the Catholic territories, for example, there's a very rapid population growth. As a matter of fact, the United States, you see a much higher population growth among the Hispanic population. Among African countries, that's another place where population growth is experiencing significant increase in some countries, and unfortunately, actually, in some less developed countries in Africa, on the African continent. You look at the Islamic world, for example. The population growth is very fast. And on the other hand, you have countries in Northeast Asia, the three countries, China, South Korea, and Japan, where we have seen rapid economic growth in the past, are starting to see population decline in these countries. In many European countries, same things happening. So I think there's the overall picture of very unbalanced population growth across regions of different religious beliefs, different ethnic groups, and I don't know, how you view this, but I think there are people out there, the politicians who look at this from a sort of from a political perspective, and it's indeed a cause of concern to these people. In terms of the overall impact on the world, I'm of the camp that I think the resources available on Mother Earth, it should be adequate to support this population. As a matter of fact, for the foreseeable population growth in the next 20 to 30 years, in my view. Technology is improving. We're more and more relying on renewable energies, for example. The primary concern used to be, the primary concern for population growth used to be the fossil fuel, depletion of fossil fuel. I don't think this issue is of any concern anymore. So I think, overall, the Earth can still accommodate more people and more population growth in the future. But I think the more pressing problem is really coming from the unbalanced issue I'm talking about, and as well as the strain on the resources from ecological as well as environmental concern in a restricted basis. In other words, in a regional economy, in a regional place, there might be implications for ecological and environmental issues.
Well, Lauren, when we talk about the contribution, let's say, from the growth of a population, people would say, oh, population dividend. Like in the case of China, in the rapid development of China, there's a surplus or strong supply of labor that obviously fuel the economic growth, and that can be to some countries like India, right?
Yes, definitely. China is now passing out of the demographic dividend period of growth, but it's moving into, or it's trying to move into, a talent dividend. So a labor quantity to labor quality source of growth. And that indeed opens up a door for other countries like India to tap into a labor quality, like their demographic dividend potential period comes after China. So that allows them, for where there are avenues for that same growth model across countries, India can now tap into that, as can Morocco, Egypt, South Africa, some other countries that are still in Indonesia in their demographic dividend potential time. So there's capacity to kind of synchronize some growth across countries too. Just because one country passes out of the demographic dividend window doesn't mean there isn't another country that is entering that, at least over the next decades and so on.
Benoit, if you go beyond this labor, or human grow up, like become a labor or in a certain industry, let's say individual development or individual, exploration of the potential, unleashing the potential. The UNFPA said that with the right investments, sound policies, and advanced planning, governments can empower every person in their countries to achieve a good quality of life. So what are the key areas that the governments need to focus on, probably to unlock the potential of their population?
Right, absolutely. Well, I think governments have to make investments really to ensure the basic necessities for their people. And that includes ensuring things like decent housing, ensuring proper levels of education, investing in education all the way to secondary school and beyond, and also ensuring better healthcare. Because often when you have shortcomings in these fields, this is what is really holding back the fulfillment of human potential. And all of those aspects I mentioned are part of the second generation of human rights. And these are socioeconomic rights that are recognized in the covenant that came into effect in 1976 and signed by the vast majority of countries in the world, including by China. So without these investments that all countries unfortunately don't always have the means to make, we really cannot unlock the potential of these peoples. But if we can ensure better distribution of growth, ensuring that we give different governments capabilities to invest in these fields, having also international organizations, NGOs as well can play a large role in this, and that's obviously going to have a massively positive impact on the fulfillment of human potential.
Mm-hmm. Well, John, if you look at the flip side of the population growth, for some people, they would point it to the climate change. They say with population growth rapidly, and then there will be more industry, more development, and more pollution. So probably climate change, the climate will get warmer. Is that kind of concern justified?
I think we human beings are very clever, and we developed. If you look at the long history of human development over thousands of years, we have developed all kinds of technologies. But I think one thing we're very sure is that the technologies developed by human beings have always sort of a step ahead of the speed of depletion of resources on Mother Earth. For example, let's talk about Elon Musk, for example. He has some great ideas about immigration to the Mars, immigration to the moon, for example. So who knows? Maybe in 40 years, when there's a huge population growth, human beings might be colonizing, the moon, for example, right? So it's something that's destined to happen, even happening way beyond our current imagination. I'm always on the camp that the human civilizations can survive, and that as long as we keep investing in our future, keep investing in our technology development, there's always going to be a solution.
Mm-hmm. Well, it seems like you are a strong believer in development. Development will solve the problems, right? But Lauren, here's the issue, and I think for others would say this is unjustified. To say, oh, it's the poor population, it's the poorer countries, it's the poorer people somehow. Their population growth that causes climate change. But actually, if you look at the numbers, it's from rich people, their lifestyle, airliners, it's private jets even. Few people fly, very, very little, or they don't fly. Isn't that, climate change probably is most of the responsibility of the developed world or the countries that develop fast?
It's definitely the responsibility of richer people, even in developed countries themselves. And it's also it's contributed to by locations of production. So that means there is a very complex relationship between population growth and environmental sustainability. The world could sustain millions of Sierra Leones because Sierra Leoneans don't contribute much to climate change at this point in time. That doesn't mean they won't tomorrow, but today they don't. So population growth and environment links are quite tenuous based on this fact that rich people indeed do tend not to have that many children, but each of their fewer children tends to contribute more and more and more to consuming the world's resources. That's the kind of quantity-quality trade-off even within families. So that's definitely not clear as a link, but indeed, depending how scientists collaborate, depending how humans respond, maybe we can adjust.
Well, Benoit, here's another concern I guess people have, especially now with the food crisis, we say, partly because of the ongoing Ukraine war. In some, I would say, like a less developed world, food could become a problem, food insecurity. And then people say you have more people, larger population, that could actually worsen the problem. It kind of reminds me of in the 1990s, probably, or even around that time, there's a book basically said with the title, Who Will Feed China? Basically the concern of with Chinese population growth, that people will be hungry. But it proves it's not that a problem. What about now?
No, yes, indeed. There is enough food to feed everyone in the world, but it's incredible when we remember that there are still millions of people, more than 300 million people, in fact, according to the UN, that are food insecure at the moment. So there is enough food, but we still have all of those crises. We still have all that food insecurity because the bulk of that food insecurity comes from a few crises and a few wars. So in reality, these are these conflicts that are the biggest drivers of hunger and all that food insecurity around the world. So geopolitical issues certainly can exacerbate problems. In your question, you mentioned the war in Ukraine. So the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which is considered the basket of Europe, is a great example of how geopolitics can affect food security, because at the beginning of the war, I think it was around last summer, Russia imposed a blockade of Ukrainian exports from their Black Sea ports. There has also been the biggest humanitarian crisis of the last 10 years in Yemen, the war in Yemen, um, which is on the way. Well, there's a ceasefire at the moment, but that was a massive source of food insecurity as well. So failures of cooperation in the international community are often a source of that insecurity. So diplomacy is needed to solve these issues, and that includes the responsibility of the UN Security Council, which should address conflicts that are most responsible for food insecurity. But obviously, one of the issues is that the Security Council of the UN is currently quite divided and unable to act on many of these crises.
But of course, the UN also mentioned that there's enough food, but it's not balanced, not even. In rich world, there's a waste of food. If they are saved, probably, then there's no problem of hunger. So, John, but ultimately, I mean, it's very difficult to solve that problem. You cannot stop an individual person, for example, from wasting food. You can tell them, maybe you are not there to tell them what to do. So ultimately, it's development. You have to solve that kind of problem.
Aggregate level, we all know that there should be enough food. For example, in the United States, you have 4 states can basically feed the entire American population. But the problem is that we have all kinds of political issues, all kinds of non-market-based policies actually in place to prevent the perfect matching between demand and supply at the aggregate level. Some countries have been emphasizing, for example, food security. It becomes a national security issue. And I'll give you some interesting example. Here in Israel, for example, this country is self-sufficient mostly on food supply, and the food supply is becoming is emphasized by the government as a national security issue. Now, when you have things like this, it's becoming more and more difficult to have entirely sort of a market-based mechanism for meeting the entire world's population of food demand. It's because of these issues, I think, that's becoming more difficult to address the entire the human population's food problem. Previous speaker said about the Russia's sanctions, imposing sanctions on exports of Ukraine grain, and that's a perfect example. So I think as long as the food is becoming a political issue, becomes a national security issue in particular, we are going to have a food problem, because the natural endowments across different countries are different. And it's not going to be the case that every country is going to have self-sufficiency in terms of food supply. And as a result, we're always going to have a food shortage problem.
Well, Lauren, as we said at the very beginning of the discussion, India is poised to become the largest population, surpassing China within 3 months. Will that mark a seismic shift in terms of the global change, in particular, I guess, here in Asia?
In principle, it's not anything more than a symbolic shift. It's simply now India will be the world's most populous country, but I don't think it changes anything substantive. Like, it doesn't give India a new position in the world immediately. It doesn't make it leader of the world. It doesn't make it anything else. Being the most populous country itself is a symbolic type of ranking or title to have. I guess what I find interesting is that it marks a shift potentially in where some growth will be over the next century in terms of, like moving from China to potentially India and on to Africa. If you look at this intersection in time, roughly now, China, India, and Africa are all at 1.4 billion people. And over the next 50 or 60 years, that, China is expected to decline, towards a billion, at some point in future. India is expected to stabilize around 1.4 billion for some time. And the African population is expected to grow towards 2 billion. So obviously that's not one single country, that's a continent. But, what any of that means really depends on what that population does. In China's case, it might get richer and richer per capita, so the economy might just keep growing, and the change might not mean much in an economic sense. But in other countries, it may not necessarily equate with growth. So I think it's symbolic, and I don't think it represents anything substantive. I think that depends on how India responds and how China responds with policies for its own per capita growth.
Well, picking up on what you have said, the China's situation, China's population declined for the first time in recent decades. In 2022, the country's total fertility rate, for example, decreased from 2.6 in the late 1980s to just 1.15 in 2021. So, Lauren, I wonder, how does this drop in birth rate impact China's future, let's say, future economic outlook, or society as a whole?
Obviously, it's going to have dramatic continued impact on the population structure. So an ever larger share of the population will be senior, and a smaller share of the population will be children. And so that takes a seismic shift in how you allocate resources across generations over time and how generations cooperate with each other. So just again, going back to this Malthus idea, Malthus basically worried that there would be so many children, and the children wouldn't be contributing to agricultural productivity, and nor could agricultural productivity itself keep up, and that meant there would be famine and war and conflict. And there's a kind of a risk in China and other countries that have a lot of seniors, that those seniors will take such a high share of the resources from their pensions to their healthcare needs and so on, that productivity will be lost again. It's like an inverse of the Malthusian fear that, if your seniors have such a big impact on society, they kind of drain the future, or they drain the resources for education of young people, for innovation and research. So what it means is that countries need to be very, very creative and careful and long run in how they distribute resources. And in China's case, I think China's quite lucky because it's old before rich, and it has sought to make sure its young people, at least a good share of them today and many more of them tomorrow, are able to be far more productive than their parents were. So the goal is that China's young people have this scientific knowledge and this much more frontier education, at least, as I said, a share of them today, and that they can pick up. So like one young Chinese might be like 3 of today's older Chinese in terms of their productivity. So, which might not be the case in Japan. Maybe one young Japanese person today is almost the same in productivity potential as an older Japanese person who was quite rich. So it's not very clear how it affects countries over time. It really depends on how the economy's changed over time, when these changes took place, and how clever countries are in balancing resources over time. If the population falls the way it looks like China's will fall, it's a question of turning that decline into an opportunity that works for all generations over time.
Mm-hmm. Well, obviously, it depends on the policy, the design of the policy to cope with these challenges. Benoit, you are in Japan. So how is the Japanese government coping with this, let's say, aging population and also at the same time low birth rate? Kind of a similar problem in China, Japan, South Korea in this region?
No, absolutely. I think for Japan, it's been at the forefront of this battle to reinvigorate or to increase the birth rate. In fact, many countries that are following on the same trend are looking at Japan to see what the government does to increase the birth rate. Unfortunately, the Japanese government so far has not been able to reverse the trends. And as other countries, history shows us that no countries whose birth rates have fallen significantly have been able to reverse the trends. The sad thing is there's no magic wand or there's no magic bullet that can increase or that can improve the problem. We've seen that people don't like to be told by governments to have children. So in Japan, there's many things that have been tried by the government, including providing or giving money to families to have more children. That has had a very minimal impact. Also, the government has tried to bringing more immigrants from specific countries in Asia through agreements with these countries. But again, as I mentioned, the real world, the real impact on the numbers, on the birth rates in Japan, because of the many issues, societal issues that it faces, we have simply not seen a real blip on the radar so far.
Mm-hmm. Well, John, I mean, how concerned are you in terms of this declining birth rate in China, aging population? Both are, seems to be big challenges for the Chinese government in terms of policy making and to, if not make them into an advantage, or at least to offset some of the challenges.
Well, I am actually less concerned. As you know, I'm actually not so much a big fan of the government getting into the the business that's happening in private citizens' private space. But I think we are going to try all these things, policies that have been tried before in Japan, in South Korea, in some European countries. But I totally agree with our guests here that the effectiveness of these policies. I'm kind of skeptical about the effectiveness of these policies. Nevertheless, I do want to mention a few words about immigration. Japan is actually, starting to be more open to inbound immigration from other countries. If you look at what's happening in the United States, for example, it's indeed the immigration is also contributing immensely to the population growth overall, adding about 1 million people a year in the United States. I think here in China we're not so much familiar or so much open to the concept of immigration. But I venture to say that in the future, when we do have a sort of a severe population decline problem, immigration actually is a very effective tool. We have a lot of room and space for accommodating a policy like that. I would imagine in the future, maybe in 20, 30 years, there will be actually, some jobs going to be mostly taken by immigrants. And it's not actually a bad idea. And we should take an open-minded attitude towards that. At the very least, I think there are places in the world that are experiencing strong population growth, and those people may not be just constrained and restricted in that country. I think there are space and also room for at least talking and discussing and debating about this immigration policy in the future as a way of addressing China's future population decline issue.
Yeah, open to new policies, a new practice. Well, with that, we come to the end of today's discussion. Many thanks to our guests. You can also find us on the CGTN app on YouTube. Thank you for being with us. I'm Xu Xinduo. See you next time.